Thank you, Christina. The gentleman who gave me a microphone to put in my pocket, I don't know what I did with the microphone. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm extremely grateful to have been asked to participate in this event. And it's an event that poses a challenge to me to think on this occasion about what I have thought, to think it in a new way and in conjunction with the work of Alfred North Whitehead. In fact, as a much younger person, I studied Whitehead twice, although I could not say exactly what I derived from that reading before I began to read again in preparation for these events. I remember thinking that, like Hegel, he provided an important alternative to the way that subject and object were framed in conventional epistemological debates. I also knew that there was a place for curiosity in his work, that he offered an alternative to positivism without denying facts, and that the world, including nature, was animated in ways that were compelling to me. I associated him with Dewey and with American forms of Hegelianism, and in one context I studied Whitehead in relation to pragmatism, and in another in relation to American philosophy, focusing on William James. In the last years, I've been grateful to have my attention brought back to Whitehead by the work of Christina Hutchins, Roland Faber, who have suggested connections between his work and my own. But I have also become more mindful of the recent contributions of Bruno Latour, Steve Shaviro, and Isabelle Stengers, all of whom show the implications of Whitehead's work for the history of science and science studies more generally. In the case of Stengers, in particular, Whitehead's approach to science is reconciled with his approach to theology, offering a rare and sweeping account of this philosophical project. One remark of hers drawn from Whitehead has stayed with me as I've been reading and writing for this occasion, and that is the following. I quote, "Critical consciousness admits so many things without criticizing them." Does critical thought show more than it says, and is it more profoundly implicated in a set of relations than it itself can say and know? I leave it for the moment as an open question, since we have to know more about what critical thinking is, indeed what thinking is, and we cannot know it apart from its occasion. On this occasion, that's the title of my paper, on this occasion, what I happen to remember is less important than how reading him came to affect me, which is to say how the text acted on me even if I was not always fully aware of how it was acting. In this sense, I'm acted on in ways I do not always know, and my thinking admits to a history that it cannot fully thematize or narrate. Since what I understood from reading him is that I do not unilaterally determine my reading, nor does the text read me, or determine what I say about it. Rather, I am solicited by something that is there, and what is there is also in some ways solicited and animated by me or by my reading more properly. This can be described as an interaction, to be sure, but it is a curious one. Since both subject and object are animated in relation to one another, some dimension of each is brought forth through the solicitation of the other, and in this sense, the aliveness of each is dependent on a certain provocation coming from the other. This raises the question of non-human modes of acting, or, more specifically, acting on. And perhaps what is most interesting is that such non-human modes of acting and being acted on characterize the object, in this case the text, as well as me. I want to return to this question later of whether there is non-human acting that characterizes humans, but for now, let me continue to reconstruct my path, one that begins with a certain forgetfulness about my early encounters with Whitehead's texts to my more deliberate effort to know my relation to his work. Although my memory of reading him is faulty and partial, it does not mean that his text didn't act on me, or that it doesn't still act on me without my explicit knowing. In the context of an undergraduate seminar, indeed one of the very first seminars I ever took in philosophy on American pragmatism, I read Modes of Thought, Process and Reality, and Adventures of Ideas. I read him again as a graduate student, where I was trying to understand in particular the relation between American pragmatism and Hegel, focusing on some of those intermediary figures who constituted the St. Louis school of Hegelians. I was clear that Whitehead was not an Hegelian, but there were moments of convergence that interested me. So in the last weeks, I went back and checked my fading marginal notes on Whitehead's texts, and there were some that jolted me back into a memory of how it was I was forming my own thoughts as a student. On the basis of these, I was able to see with greater clarity what of his text I took up, or rather, what of his text acted on me as I was myself acting, what of his text impressed itself upon me, animating me in certain directions as I was trying to fashion something to say. I found that the chapter that was most marked up in the margins was Objects and Subjects in Adventures in Ideas. I was clearly stopped by his remark that, and I quote, "The basis of experience is emotional. The basic fact is the rise of an affective tone originating from things whose relevance is given." The language is arresting, to be sure, especially as the sentence proceeds. The question of whether or not the basis of experience is emotional is controversial, but not grammatically challenging. Surely Kant would have dismissed the idea that the basis of experience is emotional, although he does have that very curious essay on raising the tone of philosophy. I can certainly imagine Hannah Arendt responding that the basis of experience must be thought and not feeling. But how then do we understand the scope of the emotional indexed here? The second part of the sentence makes things more complicated, since if the basic fact is the rise of an affective tone originating from things, then the usual way of imagining emotions as originating from a subject is already turned around. I'm reminded here of William James' What is an Emotion, a brilliant essay that I am sure I read in conjunction with Whitehead in my earlier years. But even there, as in James's essay on experience, we are asked to understand that those accounts of feeling and emotion that are grounded in the subject or in specific capacities or dispositions have already abstracted that subject from its embeddedness in the world, have already decontextualized that subject from the relations by which it is constituted. But let us finish the sentence. It's not just that there is a basic fact, and so we know that facts are important here, though we do not know in what precisely a fact consists, that on this occasion, the rise of an affective tone originating from things seems to be a fact. This means that the rise of an affective tone may or may not rise from things, but only that it rises and that it also originates from things. It would have been easy to write the origination from things of an affective tone, but that would have made things into the sufficient condition for the rise of an affective tone, and it will turn out that things really have to be in some kind of interrelation with other moments for that affective tone to rise at all. So if we continue, we see this reversal is conditioned yet further, since he completes the sentence, from things whose relevance is given. So it's not things on their own or in themselves that give rise to affective tone. That's already difficult to accept, given how deeply embedded the notion is that subjective feeling wells up from the subject or its soul or some other region of interiority. Whitehead, however, does something more than perform a reversal. He does not offer an object-based account of the genesis of the tonality of affect, in which no subject is in the picture. In such an account, we would have supplanted the subject-based account of affect with an object-based one, although we would have stayed within the framework that supposes that reality, including affective reality, comes either from one pole, the subjective, objective, or from the other, within that framework, unquestioned, of subject and object. Instead, Whitehead makes clear that the things that we might be tempted to comprehend as objects are in fact already established within a framework of relevance. They are relevant to an experience or a task at hand, and only in the context of this relevance to a humanly structured world does affective tone originate from things. In other words, without that prior context, things would not give rise to affective tones as they do, but within that context, or on the presumption of such a context being in place, they surely do. So though affective tone originates with things, things themselves have first to be contextualized in order to give rise to affective tone in the way that they do. Thank you. You don't see my microphone too, do you? Okay. So on the one hand, in the place of an object world or an object field, we have instead things whose relevance is given. But I clearly, years ago, underlined and starred the fact that Whitehead goes further to define what might be initially grasped as a subjective world. He writes instead about an occasion. Indeed, he stipulates, an occasion is a subject in respect to its special activity concerning an object. I just love that. An occasion is a subject in respect to its special activity concerning an object. The language is arresting, since it refuses and remakes an ordinary language presumption. We expect subjects to speak on occasion, or for there to be occasions in which subjects appear, as I am doing now, as I said I would, and as a consequence of a promise I made, even a contract I signed. But in his formulation, Whitehead defines the subject in terms of the occasion. An occasion is a subject. In Process and Reality, he makes clear that grammar has trapped us into some unfortunate postures. He writes, the term subject has been retained because in this sense it is familiar in philosophy, but it is misleading. He makes clear that what we conventionally call the subject is actually, and I quote again, the purpose of the process originating the feelings. The subject is the purpose of the process originating the feelings. The subject is not precisely an origin, neither is it a substance. It's a name we are compelled to use to describe a key feature in a process, something that the noun form rebels against, at least until it can be persuaded to release the presumption of metaphysical substance from its grip. We may well wonder whether something else can be a subject as well. It's kind of exciting. An occasion is a subject. Well, what else? Have we not already displaced the subject from an anthropocentric presumption? I think this will prove important as we return, as I hope we do, to the question of whether non-human forms of agency might indeed characterize human actions as well as others. But for now, it seems clear that it's not on all occasions that an occasion is a subject, but only on the occasion when a relation is established between a subject and, I quote, its special activity concerning an object. So once this special activity is in play, and here let us imagine the reading of a book or the sowing of a garden, an occasion is a subject. Something happens on an occasion that instates the subject through its special activity concerning an object. So as one reads or as one works in the garden, one exercises a special activity, and only on the basis of that reading or working does the occasion of the subject emerge. I'm not sure whether there can be a subject without an occasion, or whether there can be an occasion without a subject. Neither come into being without a process or an activity of some sort. I am presuming that even if on occasion, I am presuming that even if on occasion there is an occasion without a subject, that it can be an event of some kind, and that the subject in activity is already an occasion in which we would have to understand this activity as bound up with an object as well. The subject in activity without an object is surely not an occasion, or at least not yet. It's an abstraction, but nothing has taken place. So this means that the object is as essential to the occasion as the subject, hence the term occasion rises up, we might say, from the antinomy of subject and object to establish a third term, process or activity, without which neither subject nor object makes very much sense. Now, if we seek to bracket such sentences and just get to the heart of what an object is, or get to the heart of what a subject is, we find that we cannot extract the object from this complex interdynamic of activity. Indeed, Whitehead seems to be warning us against such an operation when he remarks, and I quote, "Anything is an object in respect to its provocation of some special activity within a subject." End quote. So something converse is clearly true, namely that the object itself only comes into play, rises, emerges on the condition that it provokes or is part of a provocation of some special activity within a subject. So we cannot exactly come up with a list of things that qualify as objects, since typologies won't do. On the contrary, we're now asked to understand that objects provoke or are situated within a provocation, or perhaps themselves induce a provocation, and that without that provoking or soliciting activity, there would be nothing we could call an object. They impinge upon us as subjects and ask something of us. And if this were not occurring, we could not be subjects at all, neither would there be objects. An object cannot provoke all on its own. There is no fully self-generated emanation coming from the being of the object. On the contrary, it has to act on the subject, even something spatially conceived as in the subject, in order to qualify as an object at all. When the object acts on us, it does not monopolize activity. It solicits us or sparks our action. So where does the action begin, and where does it end? What Whitehead has offered are broad criteria for subjects and objects. Anything can qualify as an object if it provokes a special activity within a subject. Anything can be a subject if it becomes an occasion for a special activity in relation to an object. I'm not sure whether subjects provoke objects, but I don't see why they can't. Stenger seems to suggest that they certainly do, precisely in the example of scientific investigations. Objects surely provoke subjects, or rather their special activities. That's how we know them, and how we ourselves become knowing beings. If subjects provoke objects, it doesn't happen only in the usual and expected ways. A mode of inquiry can provoke an object to display or animate some dimension of itself. And this is something different from a technical dissection of the object or a mode of testing its reactions in a controlled environment. Let us remember that both object and subject have been redefined in the course of this exposition. After all, there is no object without a relationship, and no object without an occasion. As Whitehead puts it, the term object expresses the relation of the entity to one or more occasions of experiencing, end quote. I'm reminded here of Gertrude Stein's Meditations on Objects in Tender Buttons. And I thank Astrid for her wonderful paper on Gertrude Stein earlier today. I think we were, in fact, lighting on some of the same issues, although Astrid Lagrange has done, I think, a much more thorough job. I'm only going to say a couple of things. Gertrude Stein, of course, writes many things, but among them are two propositions that resonate with Whitehead, at least two. The first I offer to you. A large box is handily made of what is necessary to replace any substance. Yes. Great. I mean, it's all done. Suppose an example is necessary. The plainer it is made, the more reason there is for some outward recognition that there is a result. How do we read this? A large box is able to replace the metaphysical category of substance because it has something necessary, is made of something necessary to make that substitution possible. It would seem that an example, the large box, is necessary since it specifies the substance and so evacuates it of its metaphysical generality, at least according to Butler. The more plain it is made, the more reason there will be for a recognition of the box, a result of a perceptual activity, something that comes forth from the subject. Here's the second remark from Stein. What is the use of a violent kind of delightfulness if there is no pleasure in not getting tired of it? I'll give it to you again. What is the use of a violent kind of delightfulness if there is no pleasure in not getting tired of it? One expects the line to be a question, and though it is open-ended, it stubbornly remains in a declarative mode. One might expect a kind of free-floating condition, delightfulness, an abstract quality specified paradoxically or perversely as violent, but then it appears that such free-floating states cannot exist without provoking something in a subject, a pleasure that is bound up with not getting tired of this violent kind of delightfulness, of wanting it again, and that very delightfulness being precisely what one wants again and again, a pleasure that is renewable. Emotional states do not exist in the abstract. They neither float freely in the objective world, nor are they purely subjective phenomena. They emerge from the world and in relation to the world, and they never quite get free of that double valence. In these formulations from both Whitehead and Stein, though, we can see that, appropriately contextualized, the object is said to provoke a special activity in the subject or by the subject. The special activity is an immanent feature of the subject, though only possible until such time as it is provoked by an object on a given occasion. None of this happens only in the abstract, but has to be part of what is called experience. If a mode of activity is provoked, then we have to be able to understand a mode of activity that is itself acted upon, and acted upon in such a way as to induce or instigate the mode of activity itself. This mode of acting in the midst of being acted on, or acting as a consequence of being acted on, and in relation to being acted on, brings us closer to what Whitehead called apprehension. A mode of activity provoked by an object is apprehension. But what is most interesting for me is what follows from this, namely the claim, and I quote, that no prehension can be divested of its affective tone, end quote. Since we've already been told that affective tone originates in objects, and now we learn that prehension is a mode of activity provoked by an object, we might conclude that affective tone belongs to a prehensive sphere precisely because prehensions are also provoked by an object. Affective tone originates in provocation. It originates in an object, which is to say that the object provokes feeling, which is not quite the same as saying that the object causes feeling, my feeling, anyone's feeling. Indeed, provocation is different from cause, and even might be said to take its place. We can turn aside from provocations, and much of ethical life depends on how well any of us respond to provocation. We'd like the police force at Berkeley to respond to provocation a little bit with greater restraint. But the provocations that we tend to understand as part of conflict or seduction within the sphere of human relations also extend to other organisms. Indeed, they seem to constitute a kind of agency that is no way restricted to the human. Provocations are wagers, and there is no guarantee that they will work. So there is some contingency in this entire scene that is meant to account for the onset of feeling. There is indeed some contingency in this scene that does not really happen without affective tone. So let us think about non-human agency for a moment, and then let me return to feelings, and then finally to a reflection on my own recent work on precarious life and the stakes of war. I'll try to say something about gender as well, but maybe not much, as a way of describing how one might get from performativity to precarity, but I'm just not sure I can do this in the time that remains. To understand non-human agency, we would have to be able to consider at some length what Whitehead means by an organism. But for our purposes, let's offer a sketch of an argument. First, there is no interrogation of an organism without the organism responding in some way to the interrogation, and without the interrogation also being a certain activity of an organism. In other words, the human knower is not relieved of its status as an organism when it seeks to study an animal, a microbe, or a set of cells. Both the organism that is the object and the one that launches the scientific investigation are bound together by a complex set of interrelations. The effort to know is itself an activity that seeks to comprehend the object before it, and the object is established through that knowing activity, even as the object exceeds that particular instance of knowing. No act of knowing establishes the object once and for all. We have to be able to think the situation in which both subject and object emerge from or arise out of occasions. The object can be grasped neither through an analytic decomposition into its component parts, nor as a cause in a pre-established system of causality. Its contingency is bound up with its knowability, and what results is not a perspectivism in which the object only exists to the extent that I know it. On the contrary, it exists now on this occasion in which it provokes my knowing activity, in which something happens between us, but also clearly on many other occasions in which I am fully absent. When I am involved in this activity called knowing, I'm curious, I'm seeking something new, but in such a way that I cannot negate or consume the object I seek to know. Is it there, recalcitrant but also provocative? And is this what we might call its enduring life, one that emerges again and again, occasion after occasion? I believe what Whitehead calls an eternal object. The object forms itself in relation to my knowing activity, but never exclusively, and the way it is formed, what Whitehead sometimes calls its self-formation, is bound up with the question of life, its life, the occasion in which life becomes an issue. Latour, describing Stenger's on Whitehead, insists that in the human interaction with organic life, organisms are also existential entities, by which he means that they wage a bet on life. That's his phrase. They wage a bet on life. Like us, they have to move outside themselves, engage in prehensions, develop a relationship to the world that is necessary for their survival. It is as if everything living has tentacles of one kind or another, and these prehensive activities are part of the organism, not something added on, and certainly not something inessential. They are aspects of the organism. They are also modes of relationality, open-ended, not fully knowing, bound to the world, seeking to further existence on yet one more occasion. They may not don their spectacles and hunch over a book, but they are nevertheless engaged in exploratory functions that are like our own. Let us remember that a prehension is a mode of activity provoked by an object. The investigator can, in this sense, be the object for the object, which is another way of saying that there is a certain modality of agency on both sides of this scene. The objects provoking the subject's activity take place at once, and what will serve as the object and what as the subject is clearly changeable. Indeed, no matter how we identify subject and object in this scene, we're left with a situation in which forms of activity and agency are to be found on all sides. This seems to be a situation in which agency is clearly separable from the subject. What acts is not necessarily a subject, since the subject itself acts only when acted upon from elsewhere. And being acted on, being provoked, does not have to be by another organism. It can also come from one's own history or the history of organisms. This is what Whitehead called the real agency of the actual past. Something acts on me, provokes me. That is me, that precedes me, to which I respond and act, and without which I would not be who I am. This something that precedes me does not determine me, but acts on me time and again, and acts on me at the moment in which I too am acting to secure or further my existence yet again. And where existence is at issue, where existence is a concern, there is inevitably affective tone. My agency is neither exclusively mine, nor is it exclusively human. As a human animal, I test the environment of which I am a part and upon which I am fundamentally dependent. The explanation I offer of any organism is itself an expression of the life of an organism. My explanation enacts or admits what it cannot fully understand. It is in this way that the all-too-human activity of critique has to be rethought as the provoked activity of the human animal. Only then will we be able to understand the phrase with which I began, from Stenger's, critical consciousness admits so many things without criticizing them. In waging a critique, we admit we are organisms, act in a way that shows how fully non-anthropocentric our acting really is, and in this way, we admit to something that we do not know how to think about within the terms of critique conventionally defined. Okay, this may well be true, although I cannot help thinking that Whitehead is surely offering a critique of positivism, of causality, or metaphysical foundationalism, even on views that seek emphatically to separate science and theology. So, is it really true that the operation of thought that we call Whiteheadian is clearly uncritical, or that it takes place to the side of the tradition of critique? That's Latour's argument. But I want to suggest that surely if we think of critique as a distinctly human activity, we lose the ways in which thinking agency is like other kinds of agency, and then we fail to understand what we do even at the moment in which we seem to be most understanding. But if we take into account, of course, that our acting may well have something non-anthropocentric in it, that it's not fully human acting, including the act of critique, why can't we rethink critique to take into account that very point? Well, you've been very patient, and I'm not sure how to turn to my own work, or whether I have really been doing something other than my own work up until now. This feels like work, and it's mine. It's mine. It's mine, it's his, whose is it? I don't know. Am I the subject or the object of this scene? One of the most obvious things to say is that my early work made reference to nature only through the sex-gender distinction, one that assumed that nature was a fact, or at least a given, and that gender was somehow constructed or articulated through linguistic and cultural means. And though I did not mean to be offering an account of nature, it seems to me that I did, and in a way that was not thought through. I've learned a great deal in the interim, especially from feminist philosophers of science, such as Anne Fausto Sterling, about the interactive and developmental histories of both sex and gender. I did not consider at the time that there might be a social history of nature that would be relevant to my thinking about the sex-gender distinction. I failed to know and consider those interactive models that seek to establish that biology is responding to culture and culture to biology. I think those models clearly bring us closer to Whitehead. But more recently, I've come up against a certain ecological challenge to my thinking, articulated by Vicky Bell and some others, and it emerges in light of some of the theorizations of precariousness I've offered in the context of thinking about war. So in some of my recent work, I've tried to understand why, under conditions of war, but also under general conditions of nationalism, certain lives appear to be more grievable than others. I've sought to rethink a certain Marxist vocabulary in light of the problem of who is grievable and who is not. We had an excellent paper on that today as well. And so I posed the question this way: is there an unequal distribution of grievability? And perhaps a more Hegelian question I posed this way: under what conditions do we recognize a life as lost, or indeed as losable, as capable of being lost? What prompted me to ask this question was a sense that certain lives lost in war or other violent attacks were very clearly and publicly mourned, while others went unrecognized and unmourned. The question of who is publicly mournable is something I've thought about for some time. In Gender Trouble, I talked about those conditions under which lesbian and gay love is repressed, and so when a gay-lesbian relationship is lost, it can be neither acknowledged as a love nor mourned as a loss. That issue took on salience during the AIDS crisis, which continues, as you know, as AIDS becomes the major health crisis for the African continent. I turned my thinking in another direction after 9/11 in order to understand why certain lives were mourned and others not, and it seems to me that certain tacit views about who is human and who is not govern our ideas about Islam, but also that belonging to one's own nation has a humanizing effect. But to talk about certain lives is already to talk about living organisms and to come up against the question of what, if anything, distinguishes the human form or modality of the living organism from other forms or modalities. When we consider how life is destroyed in the context of war, we are up against a variety of forms of life that are destroyed or debilitated. Environments are poisoned, local habitats are destroyed, and this means that war destroys all manner of life indiscriminately, and it shows through a via negativa that those manners of life are interconnected, interdependent, and equally precarious. I have come over time to appreciate Marx's claim in the early manuscripts regarding the limits of the human sciences. He wrote, "One basis for life and another basis for science is an a priori lie," end quote. For those of you who know my work, you'll see that this means that I have to distance myself from some of the early formulations of the sex-gender distinction, in which nature was presumed to be facticity or mute materiality, and gender was the work of language, culture, and social norms. I see such distinctions can't really work, neither can their apparent opposite, socio-biological causalities or other explanatory schemes in which biological nature is understood unilaterally to determine social forms. The life of human life means that it is already connected with what is non-human, and that its connection with non-human life is essential to the life that it is. Let us then hold together this term, human life, even though its component parts, human and life, will never fully coincide with one another. In other words, we will have to hold on to this term, human life, even though, as a term, it will, on occasion, seek to contain two terms that repel one another or which work sometimes in opposite directions. The human can never fully occupy life, and life can never fully explicate the human. So whatever we might want to call existence as a human will inevitably consist of a negotiation with this tension. In my most recent work on war, both in Precarious Life and in Frames of War, I've suggested that the precarity of life imposes a set of obligations upon us. To put it this way is to insist that not only does the precarity of human life impose such an obligation, but so too does the precarity of the life that constitutes and exceeds human life. To understand the obligation we are under, we would have to distinguish between those humans who are regarded as living and those who are not, but also at the same time, or alongside, we have to distinguish between a variety of living organisms and those living organisms called human. These are already two very complex sets of tasks, and they demand that we reconsider what is meant by the derealization of life, an ethical problem that belongs to an anthropocentric scheme, and the anthropocentric view of life that derealizes other living organisms. Neither is acceptable, which means we need to navigate a path that does not founder on one rocky shore or the other. Indeed, when we talk about the derealization of certain human lives, we seem to bring up the human as the norm. Everyone should be understood as equally human, and yet it seems that if we are talking about human life, we also have to criticize that very anthropocentrism in order to understand the human as interconnected with other non-human lives. If the precarity of life imposes an obligation upon us, we have to ask about the conditions under which it becomes possible to apprehend a life or set of lives as precarious, and those that make it less possible or indeed impossible. Of course, it doesn't follow that if one apprehends a life as precarious, that one resolves to protect that life or to secure the conditions of its persistence and flourishing. It could be, as we have seen in recent wars, including the attack on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, precisely when 2008 became 2009, that the apprehension of precariousness leads to a heightening of violence, that an insight into the physical vulnerability of some set of others incites the desire to destroy them. And yet I want to argue that if we are to make broader social and political claims about rights of protection and entitlements to persistence and flourishing, we will first have to be supported by a new bodily ontology, one that implies the rethinking of precariousness, vulnerability, injurability, interdependency, exposure, bodily persistence and desire, work, and the claims of language and social belonging. The being of the body to which this ontology refers is one that is always given over to others, to norms, to social and political organizations that have historically developed in order differentially to maximize precariousness for some and minimize precariousness for others. This being, whose bodily ontology I seek to understand, is also a life among living organisms requiring a sustaining and sustainable environment. Can this being be extricated from either ecological conditions or political norms? And inasmuch as such norms saturate the landscapes of ecology, so too do ecological systems make their demand upon politics. As I tried to explain in Frames of War, to be a body is to be exposed to social crafting and form, and that is what makes the ontology of the body a social ontology. In other words, the body is exposed to socially and politically articulated forces as well as to claims of sociality, including language, work, desire, that make possible the body's persisting and flourishing. But persisting and flourishing are perhaps derived from a spinozistic inheritance, one that situates the strange activity of persistence as something that not only belongs to us essentially, but which situates us essentially in networks of being and of life that exceed us. Now, Whitehead, of course, talks about prehensions, and I found myself using the word apprehension to describe a knowing encounter that does not quite know all that it knows. The epistemological capacity to apprehend a life is partially dependent on that life being produced according to norms that qualify it as a life or indeed as part of a life. In this way, the normative production of ontology, of who can be said to exist, produces the epistemological problem of how to apprehend of life, and this in turn gives rise to the ethical problem of what it is to acknowledge or indeed to guard against injury and violence and to minimize precariousness. Of course, we are talking about different modalities of violence at each level of this analysis, and that doesn't mean they're all equivalent or that no distinctions between them need to be made. We are also talking about different modalities of life. I want to suggest that our very capacity to discern and to name the being of some subject is dependent on norms that facilitate that recognition. At the same time, it would be a mistake to understand the operation of norms as deterministic. Indeed, normative schemes are interrupted by one another. They emerge and fade depending on broader operations of power, and very often they come up against spectral versions of what it is they claim to know. Thus, there are so-called subjects who are not quite recognizable as subjects, and there are lives that are not quite, or indeed not ever, recognized as lives. In what sense does life then always exceed the normative conditions of its recognizability? To claim that it does exceed those norms is not to say that life has as its essence a resistance to normativity, but only that each and every construction of life requires time to do its job, and that no job it does can overcome time itself. In other words, the job is never done once and for all. It's in this context, or rather on this occasion, that we might distinguish between apprehending and recognizing a life. Recognition is surely the stronger term, one that has been derived from Hegelian texts and subject to revisions and criticisms for many years. But apprehension is less precise, since it can imply marking, registering, acknowledging without full cognition. If it is a form of knowing, it's bound up with sensing and perceiving, I think what Whitehead would call feeling, but not always or not yet conceptual forms of knowledge. Indeed, I think it is related to what Whitehead calls a conceptual feeling. We are affected by something. Our feeling and apprehension are ways that something registers its objective status with us and for us. A feeling is the subjective form that a datum from experience takes with us. In my view, perhaps more Hegelian, there is some obduracy, some sensuous immediacy, which lays its claim on those norms that govern what we can recognize, disrupting and rearticulating our schemes. We cannot know such an obdurate and persistent being, some way in which a living organism is there or is persisting or is not made by our knowing, nor is it on the far side of knowability and barred from our knowing by some divide between phenomenal and noumenal worlds. Certainly we can't know such an obdurate and persistent being outside of the schemes of knowledge that we have, but they certainly work upon the schemes, and they dislodge them from any presumption of Kantian subjectivism. We do not make up the thing, and neither does the thing induce our consciousness. We're bound together from the start and in partially unknowing ways. If the object solicits me, I provoke it in turn, and if I provoke it, it answers back in some way or another. I'm already in relation to this thing I seek to know before I find myself knowing it. And that's not because I generate the thing, and not because the thing holds sway over me in advance of my knowing. Knowing itself has to be rethought as a relational exchange of a particular kind. How else can we explain the fact that we can and do apprehend that something is not recognized by available norms of recognition? Apprehension is, in my view, prior to recognition. It constitutes a kind of prior relation against which the norms of recognition can be tested and evaluated and judged. It's undoubtedly close to what Whitehead called prehensions. Indeed, in my view, what we apprehend can become the basis of a critique of norms of recognition. The fact is, we do not simply make recourse to single and discrete norms of recognition, but to more general conditions, historically articulated and enforced, of recognizability. And if we ask how recognizability is constituted, we have, through the very question, taken up a perspective that suggests that these fields are variably and historically constituted, no matter how a priori their function as conditions of appearance. If recognition characterizes an act or a practice or even a scene between subjects, then recognizability characterizes the more general conditions that prepare or shape a subject for recognition. The general terms, conventions, and norms act in their own way, transforming, crafting a living being into a recognizable subject, but not without errancy, and certainly not without unanticipated results. Moreover, as much as networks of discourse prepare and craft the object for recognition, so are we as knowers crafted and prepared by the activity of knowing those particular objects. Someone calls me a name, but the name is already circulating in my world before I turn to answer that yes, that is me, or no, you have made a serious error. I understand the name in some sense before I am constituted by it, and that gap works to produce a certain critical relation to the language to which I belong, prior to any consent I might give. Several other active trajectories work on me, but surely language as well. And I'm no longer sure that language can be said to be the super sign of everything that acts on me. There, big concession. And yet language acts on me, but I'm also enacted, set into motion by that naming process. In the same way, we might say that environment acts on me, but the me is not a passive surface or recipient. There's surely some passivity involved in being acted on, but it is also what enacts me, sparks my action, informs and prompts an agency that comes to be mine. I surely do not make myself, since I'm already in the world of others, of language, of complex networks of life, before I begin to act and to do as I do. All that is not me is the condition of my acting, and I could not act without such conditions. They impinge, they enable, they sustain. They include human and non-human conditions of my persistence, and as such they can also imperil and destroy. If one were to rethink performativity within these terms, then, it would be important to try to understand this strange way we are acted on, solicited, brought out, provoked, and how what we call our acting or our doing is itself always in some ways a response to what precedes and enables our action, right? Called by a given gender. I'm acted on and solicited by gender norms, but my own acting is the further life of that norm. The norms don't simply precede me and act on me, but in acting they are reenacted and they take on a new temporal life. The performative theory of action, I think, has to be resituated in a relational understanding of living organisms, human and non-human, to understand both what sustains life and what imperils it. And as important as it is to ask whose life qualifies as a human life, we have to also ask the inverse question: what of human life is invariably non-human? So the quandary that lies before me is, how do we work in both directions at once? I am not sure, but I begin with formulations such as these. Even if my life is not destroyed in war, something of my life is destroyed in war when other lives are destroyed in war.
Since life which exceeds me is a condition of who I am, and so there is no life that is exclusively my own, even though my own life is not every other life and cannot be. If we return to Whitehead's phrase, the basis of experience is emotional, we can perhaps understand that what comes into play as a subject and what emerges as an object depends upon an occasion in which there is already concern, engagement, relationship of some kind. So when Whitehead writes, and I quote, "The basic fact is the rise of an affective tone originating from things whose relevance is given," he is telling us that one life bears upon another, that a certain relevance provides the condition under which any of us appear as subjects or any objects emerge within the horizon of experience. Perhaps we cannot understand what it is to apprehend a life without this affective tone that emerges from a scheme of relevance. We would not be and we could not know outside this conditioning relevance, the fact that bodies matter, that lives matter, even when we claim they do not, or when we act as if they do not exist. We apprehend that there is life that is not recognizable according to the dominant norms of recognition. And when we do, we have to ask, what pulls us in the direction of that apprehension, that prehension? I believe one of the papers earlier today asked what it means to feel outside the frame. And that is the question with which I'm ending. Such schemes of relevance can be denied, but they persist, haunting the infraction. They are the tacit resources upon which we draw, which solicit us in the direction of an ethic of nonviolence, or indeed of sheltering precarious life when it is in our power to do so. Thank you very much. Thank you. Should I take questions? Sure.
We're going to take some questions, but first I wanted to say thank you on behalf of all of us for being willing to be crafted by this occasion, and for crafting it into an intensely beautiful one. So, yeah. And there are microphones here. I think that they work if you have a question or a comment, or you can just say it loudly.
Please do come up and use the microphones. I'm going to move them into the walkways for you all to use, if I can get the cords to move. Please.
Nobody wants to talk to me?
Professor, can you talk a bit about what makes language hurtful? Why when an epithet is used, does one feel hurt? Is it because they recognize something in themselves in the term, or?
I actually don't think it does have to do with recognition, interestingly enough. You know, I've written a little bit about this idea of linguistic vulnerability, and I wish I understood it better, but there is a way in which we do not have control over what people say to us. There is a kind of exposure to the address of another that is, we don't consent to that. We don't get to decide who can address us, who can direct their voice, their vocalization, their words to us in large degree. We can try, but it would be a full-time activity and we would fail. So I think there's a kind of general condition of being addressable, right? Of being the kind of creature who is addressable and who cannot consent to all the ways in which one is addressed. So that's in some sense the basic condition. I think that in the case of
misogynist speech, homophobic, catcalling, racist speech, that there are clearly efforts to not just to exploit our addressability, right, but also to stop us from being able to speak back. In other words, to arrest us as speaking beings. And I think that that there's a relationship between being called an injurious name and being threatened or being assaulted. And of course, these are very tricky distinctions. There are some people who would argue that certain kinds of racist discourse are themselves assaults, and that that to be emotionally shattered is still an injury, although it's of another order than being physically shattered. But shattered it is, and injured it is. It's really hard when we start putting that into the law, how we do that. I guess my sense is that it's our emotional openness that is carried by our addressability. And in order to live in the world with any emotional openness, that is to say, with being able to bear one's addressability, one has to live in a world in which one is not endangered as that kind of creature. And I think one is endangered by that kind of really hurtful kinds of verbal injury, although it's also odd when it injures and when it does not, and which words do it and which words do not. And if we start taking up those words and working with them in our own way, are we re-injuring ourselves, or are we trying to alleviate the injurious effect of those words? These are tricky questions.
I love the violent delightfulness that you illustrated, the sense of affective tonality in Whitehead with through Gertrude Stein, and I love that it counteracts a kind of misapprehension of your work as somehow melancholic, somehow so steeped in mournfulness that we're going to sink down into depressiveness, whereas I experience your attunement to mourning as the way in which delight gets released again. And I'm wondering if in your reading now, your rereading, your returning and recognizing of yourself in Whitehead, there's a provocation of you that pertains to that delightfulness. And I'm wondering in this way, if there's something about your move now, which is extraordinary actually, and which I think we should take some credit for.
I think you should.
Oh, okay, fine. I take some I hadn't read, you hadn't read anything by me when you'd read that, when you wrote this paper.
That's not true, Catherine.
Aha! Well, this relationality goes all the way down. So we'll take lots of credit. But this move to the non-human, of course it exposes us now to exposes you to infinitely more suffering and mourning. There's a possibly immense new set of species of lives whose violation and shameful deaths you might become attuned to, so there might be even more mournfulness. But I'm sensing at the same time resources for the delight as well, and that's what I'm wondering about. If in extending your performativity into the eventiveness of the non-human socialities and the relationships that are beyond any metaphor of the social, there isn't a kind of violence delight, a kind of renewing force, a kind of energy that would be akin to what Whitehead meant by energy, which he saw as basically a paraphrase of emotion. Is that a question?
Yeah, maybe. I have two things to say in response, so let's take it as a provocation and then we'll see what my...
Yeah.
I think, let's remember that melancholia doesn't always end up in the depressive position. It does with Klein, by the way, but it doesn't necessarily with Freud. And with Freud, there's that very interesting ending of Mourning and Melancholia where he talks about the attitude of revolt, and what it would mean to break a certain kind of bond through an attitude of revolt. And we have to remember that that the most debilitating forms of melancholia, or at least among them, have to do with fidelities that cannot be broken. And as I read that as a cultural problem, one could say, like, the attachment to the norm that does you in, the attachment to the social structure in which you can only suffer, the attachment to a particular object that can only diminish you, right? There is the attitude of revolt that emerges from melancholia actually breaks that bond in the name of living, rather than dying with the one who's lost, right? So there's some kind of bid for life that happens that's bound up with the attitude of revolt. So I don't think melancholia is so depressive, and I don't think I've been so depressive. I don't know, maybe. I mean, people accused me of being, way too optimistic and happy with gender performativity, and what was drag? Was that melancholia? Maybe, I don't know. Okay, but anyway, melancholia is itself a complex field, full of ambivalence, also characterized fundamentally by ambivalence. Let me say this as well about mourning. Mourning can be rageful. So, right, you can have voluptuous melancholy, as Kristeva called it. You can have rageful grief. Clearly, we see that a lot, especially on political occasions. I wanted to say this. I've been meaning to say this since I posed the question last night about whether Whitehead could have an account of grieving. In Judaism, there is this prayer, the Kaddish, which is said over the dead, and it's actually an interesting prayer. It's partly Aramaic, partly Hebrew, and it. And I always thought, the Kaddish is the moment in which you remember the person who's gone, or you focus on who that person was to you, and you recover what that bond was. But actually, what the Kaddish does is celebrate, praise, celebrate, and affirm the world. And I thought, well, why are we doing, why is that the mourner's prayer? And it is the mourner's prayer because there's an understanding that radical loss can take us with it, right? So that the most important thing you can do for the person who is in grief is to affirm the world with them, and it's a collective prayer. And the point is to sew the person back into community, to relationality and affirmation. Now, it's part of grieving. It's part of grieving, that affirmation and that collectivity. So again, I don't necessarily think that takes us into a depressive position, and I even think rituals like that are maybe counter-depressive, or seek to be in some ways.
That seems absolutely important to me, and you know that I was just dissing the disses of you
I know.
along those lines.
I know, and I'm responding to those same specters.
Yeah, those ghosts.
Yeah.
And you're illuminating something about I'm just talking here to give you all a chance to get up to the microphone. But you're illuminating something about the process of incorporation that seems to me crucial from a Whiteheadian point of view, as well as perhaps a Freudian point of view. The incorporation of the one who has died is is a way in which I perhaps become that beloved one, but I don't become his or her death. I don't die in incorporating the dead one. That in fact, that incorporation is an incorporation of the life of the one who's died.
I guess I would say that incorporation is a wager. Like, yes, I mean, Freud was very clear. We have to incorporate. We don't have a choice. That's who we are. We are the incorporated legacy of our losses. At the same time, incorporation can take you down.
It could bring in a lot of
It can take you.
deadliness.
It can bring you into death if it's too complete. It needs to remain partial. And the question is how it can be lived as partial.
Do you like thinking about it as a kind of translation of an amplification of Whiteheadian prehensions, which are an incorporation of the past relations?
Yes, I think Whitehead assumes that a kind of balance is there, that balance and rhythm are part of the metaphysical structure of things, and I do come out of a tradition of anxiety and ambivalence. So I think it's a struggle. I can't help it. Look, it's very good. A nice Jewish girl comes and speaks to you, but this is, you're gonna hear something. You're gonna hear a little different thing.
I want you to know I've said the Kaddish for 2 different fathers.
Oh, okay. All right.
And so the rich sense of the celebration of the creation
Yes.
into which the dead one dies,
Yes.
and into which we are obligated to live, is spiritually very meaningful.
Yes.
And I loved yesterday when you reflected a little bit about the shadow of the tetragrammaton of the unspeakable divinity in Judaism as perhaps part of why you don't speak God, but part of why you might be here speaking to us.
Yeah. We're going to talk about God tomorrow morning, I think.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
And it's actually partly Catherine's question, I think,
Okay.
too. I have been thinking a lot about your question about whether Whitehead supports a theory of mourning. And I noticed, I think you're bringing something that Whitehead does not, you're bringing something to Whitehead that is required for that, I think, which is in your talk tonight, your notion of the relationships are one-to-one relationships, which for Whitehead, it's the flooding into an occasion and of the many. And the,
Yes, I
and
understand.
I think there's something about the one-to-one which mourning is about the loss of the one particular. And it's maybe say something about the plural and the singular there.
Well, I don't know if I can, but I understand what you're saying, and I actually think Whitehead and Deleuze both give us an idea of the plurality, the multitude, maybe the multiplicity would be the most appropriate term. And I think that's right. And I think the notion of networks also carries that. I think for my own explanatory purposes, I do tend to focus on the dyadic, although not always. But it's a struggle. I think social norms tend to be a kind of shorthand for me for all the multiple, the multiple practices, activities, impingements that become part of a constitutive legacy or are enacted. But I think it's a shorthand, and it allows me to substitute for that problem. But I agree. It's in some sense not fully fleshed out in what I'm doing here.
But my comment is that it's not in Whitehead in the other
Oh,
direction.
and maybe with Whitehead,
Yeah,
the
I think
dyadic.
is a little bit lacking.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe, but maybe he's living in he's working against such an anthropocentric presumption that one needs to redescribe the world in another way.
Are there any other questions?
No.
Well, thank you very,
Okay,
very
thank
much.
you.